back in 2016, which is when MVM started, mind you, Energy Empire, Manhattan Project Energy Empire came out, and it has taken this long for them to bring out effectively a new edition. Now, there had been an expansion for this original one, I think came out maybe shortly after that, not too long after that. But this, if you're not familiar, is one of Luke Laurie's early designs, and it really is the foundation for a lot of his future designs. So are some of his current ones, like Dwellings of Eldervale, Andromeda's Edge. I think a lot of the seeds were planted here for what those would ultimately be.
Yeah, I think it's very important to note that at this time, and also this being one of the first games we ever played together,
it is.
This kind of changed everything when it comes to worker placement games. I mean, worker placement games existed. It was place a worker, take an action, go around, pull your workers back up. This was the first game in my memory, and maybe it might have been the first major game to have this kind of flow where on your turn, you're either putting the workers or then pulling them all back, and there's not really a necessary like turn-to-turn structure. Right. Now, that might seem very common now, but in the day when Energy Empire released, that was a very novel experience, and it still holds up to this day, which is why I think there's so much interest in this new version of the game.
Yeah, this game back then was responsible for injecting, I think, a lot of new life into the concept of worker placement, like Ryan said. We have the new version set up here, but in large part, this is very, very, very much like the original game. It looks completely different. The graphic design and everything has been completely updated. There are some new things that we're going to talk about. But overall, it is a worker placement game where you're taking your workers and you're placing them out to do things, or, like Ryan said, you're retrieving them. Now, we got to go into a little bit more detail there, because when you place your worker here, unlike sort of the basic worker placement games of its time, if it was blocked, you could still go there. You need to go there with a worker, which is, in this game, signified by this little briefcase token, and then stack it on some energy. So in this version of the game, you're effectively stacking, and I guess you did stack then too, but it wasn't as simplified as stacking these tokens. You have to go there with the tallest stack. So if Ryan had gone there first and placed a worker, the next person would have to place a worker on energy. The next person would have to place a worker on 2 energy. And keep in mind, if you go there, you can stack as much energy under your worker as you want, even if you don't have to, making it harder for someone else to go there. So it makes the whole concept of blocking feel a lot more player controls.
There's a lot of that in here. And just based on the name alone, if you are not familiar with this game at all, it's called Energy Empire. Producing that energy is a big part of the game. And there is a very cool flow here to this game, and the game will build over time. At the very beginning, you're taking some small actions. You're going to these action spots, and a lot of what you're doing is gaining resources and building buildings to add to your energy empire. Those buildings are going to do a variety of different things for you as you play, but the real key here is after you're done placing your workers, or just like at any time, if you don't want to place one, you can pull them all back, and there's a whole generating energy turn that happens. Not like at the end of a round. It just happens when you do it. You just decide you're going to pull them back, and you're gaining these dice. And these dice are how you're producing energy. So over the course of the game, you're taking small actions, you're getting a few dice, then you're gaining more dice as you go. So you're rolling more dice, generating more energy, and it builds and builds and builds until you're rolling this pile of dice in a very satisfying way. And then you're just pulling in all that energy and then spending it. And it's really cool to see how that game evolved. And I think it's worth noting that almost 10 years later, when they brought this over, all they really did was a graphical update. They didn't need to balance the game or update the game. Like, that's how good the game was originally.
I believe there are a couple tiny, tiny little tweaks that they've made to a few cards. But nothing massive has been done to this game because it was really well designed. Now, they have added some things to give it a little bit more variability and to change things up a little bit. And again, we'll get to that in a second. But even back then, it injected a lot of things to worker placement that I hadn't seen before, even like effectively an event track. As you play the game, like Ryan said, you're going to get out of sync with other players. So if you're generating, one of the things that's going to happen is necessarily you're going to take one of these pollution tokens. Now, depending on the dice that you roll, this pollution might come to your player board. It might come as really bad pollution on the nuclear side. Or you might not take any pollution at all, but you're always going to be taking one of these off. And every time you take a whole stack off, you're going to flip over the global impact card, which is effectively an event that'll take place. It'll impact the game, hence the name, in some way, shape, or form. Again, another thing that I hadn't really seen in too many games. It really felt very thematic. And speaking of theme, the whole concept of energy empire and trying to do all of this while maintaining a healthy environment. All that pollution that goes on your board is bad for your point scoring. So there are going to be a lot of things that you can do to eliminate that pollution. It's a big, big part of the game.
Yeah, you're adding those pollution tokens. You're adding some like oil wells to start drilling out there. And yeah, you have to manage that. So again, when you're rolling those dice, like I said, over your generation turn, you have the option of what kind of dice you're rolling. And based on how you're playing the game, some of like the crude energy, like you can turn in your oil barrels for this oil dice that will be sure to generate pollution. Or you can try to go like a hydro or solar, which is a lot harder. It can be more expensive. It can be harder to gain those dice, but they're cleaner and they're going to preserve your environment, which means later you don't have to do all the work on the back end cleaning up your environment. But that is where all these different buildings come into play. There's several different types of buildings that you're adding to your Tableau. And each time you take a worker action in one of those sections, you can fire off the like buildings. And this too is where you're going to find a lot of the combo fun of this game of like, okay, I'm going on a strategy that's going to get a lot of oil, a lot of pollution, but I have all these buildings that clean up my pollution. And that's just like one strategy that you can try to do. There are so many different ways you can build out your Tableau with all of these unique cards.
Yeah, it is really interesting, and we kind of glossed over that. That is probably one of the biggest aspects that made this feel like what I call now a Luke Laurie game. Sure. You're placing workers, but you're also building a tableau of cards. And again, like we said, have you seen plenty of games since 2016 that have done that? Yes, but this is one of the first. And it's really interesting because like the engine that Ryan alluded to, when you go to one of these colored areas, like the green area here, after you take your action, in any order, you can fire off any of the green cards you have. Now, you don't just get to fire them off willy-nilly. You have to activate them, again, with workers. But this time, it doesn't have to be just workers. You can just use some of your surplus energy. So as you can tell, as the game goes on, as you're going out to some of these places, acquiring dice that you're going to keep for the rest of the game, you're going to have a lot of dice. You're going to be generating a lot more energy than the 2 that you start with. So you're going to use that energy to go to places that might otherwise be blocked. But you're also going to use that energy a lot of the time to fire off a lot of the cards that you've collected in your Tableau.
For sure, and it scales. I mean, that's what I really enjoy in a game, that scale up of like by the end of the game, you're generating a ton more energy. You're maybe getting 2 or 3 at the beginning, but you could be getting 8 or 9 energy. Plus there's spaces you can go to get up to 6 total workers. So you could, like your last couple turns can be spread out, which is why though there is kind of a track to the game. There's no real rounds, but there is a track. And as people take that refresh turn, as they pull their people back, and as they clear this pollution, those events fire, eventually leading to the end of the game.
Yeah, and like I said, there's going to be these events that let you do a thing. This one says moon landing. It has a little flavor text, but it allows everyone to trade in science for a point if they want to.
Pretty good.
Some of them not so good. I think some of the late game ones are a little bit more impactful, but that is the main way that the game is going to end once you get through all of those tokens and the last pollution is taken. However, in this version of the game, there is another way the game could end. You don't have to play this way, but on this side of the board, we've got the Doomsday Clock. This is part of what the expansion was for the original.
Cold War expansion.
The Cold War expansion brings in a lot of different things, one of which is the Doomsday Clock, which is another space that you can go to. When you go here, you're going to pay the amount wherever this marker is, and then at the end, you're going to move it, and it's going to move around. If it ever gets all the way around to 12, that will end the game too.
And this also, in a bad way. That's the Doomsday Clock.
Yeah, it's not a great way, but if you're a person that have been activating the Doomsday Clock, you're going to be getting a lot of these
Cold War cards.
The Cold War cards give you basically points, pure and simple. Each card is going to be worth 1 point, but at the end of the game, it's also going to give you some points depending on how far around the Doomsday Clock this went.
Yeah.
In 3 different categories.
Yeah, basically the 3 Cold War categories.
Yeah.
Like this represents that Cold War. And if you don't want to play with it, like David alluded to, if you just don't want to use that, flip over the other side of the board and it looks more like the traditional board. But everything that came with Cold War is in this game, including the mega structures, which you'll see up here, which are just better, bigger buildings you can build, the cards. And the Cold War expansion originally had a bunch of cards that mix in. We've already done that. We've mixed all those cards in. There's new agendas, new buildings, basically new everything that comes with that. It's all in one box now, and they've actually added a few things to the game as well, on top of just including that expansion.
Yeah, one of those things is the UN Envoy. The old UN track was kind of it always felt like kind of a leftover action where you're like, well, I guess I'll go here and go up on the UN track.
Yeah, and it gives you a lot of points. So you're like, you do feel like you kind of have to at some point.
Well, as soon as other players do, you feel like, well, I need to do that too. But they've replaced that, if you want, with this track, which is the UN Envoy, which you go here. It makes it a little bit more interesting. There's all these different, in fact, they have a lot of them that go along with the UN Envoy. You're going to pick player count plus one of those tiles, and when you go here, you can spend one of the resources to do the corresponding thing and move up on these various track cards that do different things. So it's going to give the game more than just a little more flavor, but going to help you navigate maybe your own little engine that you've started to build.
Yeah, it's more than just points. And again, those are modular, like David said. So every time you play the game, you're going to have a different experience with that. And they've also redone and added a solo mode specific for this. It's called Clash of Nations solo mode. And so if you're a big solo gamer, this is going to have that as well. So this is kind of like the definitive version of Energy Empire. I mean, everything that's been released to date, new versions of everything. And you can, decide for yourself whether or not you like the new direction they're doing. This is a whole series they've done.
Yeah.
They already released the first game in the series, and the third game they've teased. They've teased it. They showed a blurred out version of the box. So they're definitely planning on doing more games in this theme. And if you have them all, you'll notice the iconography is going to kind of match up across all three. So if you're a completionist like me, I kind of want the three. They look really cool and they're spread out next to each other too.
Yeah, but this one in particular, if you're watching this and you'd never played Energy Empire, it really is one of the best worker placement games of all time. I think if we made a list of top 10 worker placement, it's definitely in the top 10. It may be in the top 5.
And again, this is unpaid content. We're doing this because we love the game. So I feel like I can say whatever I want. It is definitely probably in the top 5 of the top 10 for me. Not just because the worker placement mechanic is so interesting, but then you're mixing it in with the dice rolling and you're mixing it in with the Tableau building. And who doesn't like firing off the Tableau and getting all this stuff? And again, I've mentioned it twice in this video. I'll mention it one more time. That escalation of the way the game ramps up so that by the end, you just feel like the infrastructure that you're building, you really feel like you're building an energy empire. You're firing off so many different buildings. And we didn't mention this when we talked about the Doomsday Clock. But if you go here, it's kind of a wild, each one of these locations lets you fire off that color of building. The Doomsday Clock lets you fire off all of your buildings. So you can...
If you have the workers and energy.
Assuming you have saved up the energy, but towards the end of the game, when you're rolling like 6 dice or whatever, you're able to fire off a lot more of those. And it's one of the more satisfying experiences I think I've had in all my time playing board games.
Yeah, like Ryan said, this is kind of the ultimate edition of the game. They've even added some things, in addition to the things we've mentioned, some variability. They've got these tiles here that you can just simply choose whichever ones you want. They're two-sided. They replace a lot of the actions. Now, they don't wildly replace them. They're going to do largely quite similar things, but it's enough to give you a little more flavor where you're like, oh, now I go to this location and I get money also instead of what I used to get, because that's a nice way, because usually they've got things divided up very clearly. There's areas to get money. You're not getting any money over here, but there's going to be some tiles in these sets that let you change that up. And you can, like we said, you can use all these tiles, you can use one of them, some of them, whatever you want. It definitely adds some variability.
And I think that's great when you have experienced players that maybe were really good with the first edition, playing it with new players, because they're like any game, you played enough times and you go, okay, if I hit this and then this and then this, I create this chain. Well, not anymore, because you have to reevaluate each action because it's going to do something a little bit different. And it kind of puts everybody on more of an even field when it comes to like determining the efficiency of each action, which I think is interesting because like he said, yeah, you can use all of them and change up every action or just a few or just one even, like however you want to do it to make this a little bit more unique.
Yeah, and that is Manhattan Project, Energy Empire. If you have any more questions about it, check out their campaign, but also go over to Rado's channel. Check out, he has one of his playthroughs and some of his thoughts on it. I know he's a big fan as well. But if you have any questions, please make them in the comments below. We'll get down there and answer whatever we can. Until next time, though, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.